So, just very briefly, I'm head of digital development for Novartis, which particularly is in our global drug development organization. So, we run primarily all of our phase 2, 3 trials at Novartis. Do you want me to say more?
I think that anybody want to know more?
Like
Are we good to go?
seems like it seems like a quiet crowd, and I figured like they're not going to really care about what my background is. They really want to dig into the content.
It's like testifying. We need to certify you as an expert before you're allowed to testify.
Right, exactly.
Craig?
Good morning. I'm Craig Lipset. I work here at Pfizer, but down in New York at our New York site. I'm also part of our development organization at Pfizer. I look after clinical innovation, which includes a number of our digital initiatives, as well as our patient engagement programs, our multi-stakeholder collaborations and consortia. And it's a pleasure to be here with this group this morning.
Hi, I'm Matt Bryant. I head our clinical technology and experience lab focused on early and late development, clinical innovation. So we have a group that's focused on more design-based innovation, and then my group's focused more on patient centricity and digital health capabilities.
That's great. Well, thank you guys for coming out and for being part of the warm-up group here to get everyone going. As we go through this, if you have questions, please do jump in. This isn't meant to be just them talking at you. We've got a small enough room here that I really hope folks will get engaged. I'd love to hear from each of you, maybe an example of what, you're here thinking about clinical trials and IoT, and obviously we're all working in the space to some extent. When you think of what we're talking about here today, what's a project that comes to mind from your space that you think is illustrative?
Yeah, so you'll actually see it in my slides today, although it won't be actually the subject of my talk because my talk is fairly off point from Internet of Things. But so what comes to my mind is the Awake heart failure study that we're running right now, which is a phase 4 study designed to assess the impact of Entresto, our heart failure drug, versus a comparator on a patient's quality of life. And the traditional way you would do it, in fact, many people still do it today, is you would give a paper-based survey to your patients, have them fill it out every so often. Our team took a different approach, so they actually integrated a physical actigraphy watch from Philips. They actually have a survey that's integrated into a smartphone, which we provision, but actually we're seeing now that people are starting to prefer to bring their own device, which is kind of cool in the study, and then also we have a home sleep test. Now, Dan, what you said at the intro is scaring the crap out of me right now with all of the context. But I mean, when you look at, I think the way the rationale that we got to for introducing all these things into our study is that it's got to be much better than giving a survey to somebody, right? So when you're faced with two evils, I mean, choosing the better of the evils, we're going to get 100 million minutes of data from those physical actigraphy watches, right? So we're going to have to make sense of that. But at the end of the day, what comes back to in my mind is this is a lot more patient friendly. It's a lot more integrated into the way they live their lives. We're not asking them to come into a sleep clinic, which I don't know how you get any useful data from that because it seems so, hard to fall asleep with all those things attached to you. And at the end of the day, our biostatisticians took a look at this, and they had originally estimated that it would be about 5,600 patients and change to power the paper-based study. But when we dug into all of the data we were going to get from this trial, integrating these new technologies and sensors, taking a look at what we believe would be the participation rate as well as the retention rate, they came up with an estimation that we would really only need about 140 patients to power this new way of doing things. So when you take a look at that, we could be way off base at the end of the day. So this could totally go south. So don't get me wrong that we've solved the problem. But when you look at that, I would argue that there's no more patient-centric way to approach, trials with, than not having to include people that you wouldn't have you wouldn't need anyway if you have better tools to measure better sensitive data. So that's what really is coming to my mind. And the problem we're trying to get over now is how do we do this at scale? And that's probably something else that we could probably have a conversation about as well.
Yeah, that would be a great topic around scaling these things. I was thinking about your question, Dan, and I'm glad I didn't have to go first. I think to me one of the examples I would call out is some work we've been doing over the last 2 years in lupus with the Lupus Research Alliance. And the reason it stands out as different to me is, for years before that, we might have come up with a great new digital tool that we thought would be great for a given study. We're going to talk later in the day about things like remote trials. We thought that would be great. We talked to some patients, but that was 9 years ago when we started that program. Fast forward to the present, when we started working on new digital endpoints for our lupus programs, the first thing we did was engage with patients and engage with the Lupus Research Alliance and start to talk to patients and other caregivers about the endpoints that mattered most to them that weren't being correctly captured in their eyes. And that led to programs on ResearchKit that are now being validated. That led to explorations around other wearables, around the things that were important to them. And to build on the point that you were just making, Jacob, when you are engaging with patients actively as collaborators in that way, where you're iterating the design based on that feedback over and over again. And in the end, when you see that the patients are coming to you saying, you have now helped me to communicate how I'm feeling in a way that I was not getting across otherwise. I think that was a great win. And, it's not an exceptionally high-tech program, but I think the way of engaging patients is directionally correct.
Well, first of all, those are great examples. I won't sit here and say Amgen's ahead of anybody. We're certainly trying to catch up quite a bit. And it feels a bit like we've been somewhat absent at these types of conferences in general. But I think we're here to showcase a little bit about what we're trying to do and where we're trying to go. As far as an early example, we essentially, I joined Amgen a couple of years ago, and I don't think they really understood at the time what patient centricity was about. We didn't have a patient centricity organization. We weren't listening to patients. We weren't engaging with them. We certainly weren't getting any feedback during a study, but all of those things are happening now. In addition to that, on the technology side, we've conducted some experiments. We've done some tests. We have a proof of concept that generated 9 billion data points in a couple of weeks. And now the heads of our organization are talking to FDA about it, asking them, are they ready? And so I think, we're still catching up, but those are the kinds of examples that are really resonating. So I'm really here to kind of learn from you guys too, and see what you've done, and make sure that we're partnering together. I think there's some opportunities externally with collaborations in this pre-competitive space that didn't exist a number of years ago. And so we need to leverage that, and all of that's for the benefit of patients. And so that's what I am.
Yeah, it's worth noting, I think, that all of those answers really did involve the patient viewpoint, and that it's hard, I think, now to talk about these advances without considering the patient viewpoint, because it really does revolve around not just throwing technology into existing paradigms, but trying to shift the paradigm a bit. And so there's a branch point in these conversations, and we can either go, and I think maybe we'll start to go in one direction, and then we'll go in the more optimistic direction afterward. Folks talk about regulators a lot, and they talk about regulations, and there's no question we work in a highly regulated environment. How does that impact the kind of work you're trying to do? How does it impact trying to make change? And beyond the obstacles, are there opportunities introduced by the fact that this is such a regulated environment? First part's easier than the second.
I strongly believe that we are not operating anywhere near the upper limit of the legal and regulatory constraints of our environment. And that all too often, it's a very convenient opportunity to say no or to push back. It's what so many in our own organizations have been rewarded for doing for a very, very long time. And pointing at regulation is an easy out. How many studies have been shut down by the regulators because of your digital device? How many patients have died because of your digital device? How many of your colleagues have been fired because of their incorporation of a digital device in their programs? It hasn't happened. This is a very easy opportunity to say we can't do things, when in fact we can. And we can work collaboratively with the regulators. When we look at collaborations like the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, City, public-private partnership of the FDA with Duke, stakeholders there from pharma, from investigators, technology, patients. Which stakeholder launched their mobile and digital initiative inside of City? The FDA did, because they wanted to be ahead of this. It wasn't pharma showing up saying, FDA, you have to work with us. It was FDA opening the door saying, industry, come work with us. So I would challenge in any organization today the notion that because we're in a regulated environment, we simply can't do these things. It's false.
I'll just add to that. I mean, I think City's a great example. I think others, TransCellerate's trying to get in this space now as well, patient technology and shared data commons, right? And other groups, I think IMI, I'd like to discuss with you guys this week too, to understand, what if there's some value there with it as well. Anywhere novel digital endpoints are coming up more and more. So I think that collaboration with regulatory agencies, is a key factor. But to your point, internally, we struggle with the same thing. I feel like that's my core role now is working with those enabling functions to show the opportunity and showcase that. But yeah, they do. They tend to throw regulation at you and scare you. But you have to fight through that, and you have to teach others to fight through it in order to be effective. It's not any small number of people that are responsible for that. It's everyone, and building a culture around that, and that's the real challenge.
Yeah, I mean, I can't add much more because I completely agree with what both of you said. I mean, to me, there's a real cultural element here that we need to solve, and I think if we're really looking to embrace digital holistically in clinical development, which obviously I think most everyone here would be passionate about, I think we're going to have to engage the rest of our organization successfully. And that's often the hardest thing to do, right? It's the most intangible. It's the hardest thing. But if we're going to embrace this holistically as an industry, that's what we need to move forward and do. So yeah, it's an important issue.
Just one other quick comment. I think definitions and the common language with regulation or with regulatory groups and legal and compliance, privacy is important, because I think what we've struggled with, at least, is we tend to think the word device, means something that it's not. It gets thrown in with a drug or medicine delivery device, and regulations around that. And so that's what we're doing a lot of right now.
And I realized, Dan, no one actually addressed the second question that you threw out, whether I believe whether there was an opportunity in all this. I don't know if I'll address your question directly, but there's a couple opportunities that come to my mind. I mean, all of this is so new, right? That what the challenge really is that I've seen so far at Novartis is that because there's an absence of definitive regulations on a lot of these things, the definitive guidance rather, and oftentimes the guidance in and of itself is opaque and ambiguous to an extent. That vacuum gets filled with a lot of noise, and I think there is an opportunity to actually come together in these forums like City and these other things, and really shape really effective guidances faster, help the regulators in some way do it faster, so that we can close the gap and fill the vacuum which is currently there with actually good, meaningful guidance that folks can really adhere to. I think there's an opportunity to really bridge the cultural gap there.
I think a lot of folks on the panel have already mentioned a number of the different consortium collaborations that are active in this space. And that's a good thing. There are a lot of reasons for folks to come together. I think what we need to make sure that all of us are avoiding is redundant efforts across TransCellerate City, IMI, Coalition Against Major Disorders, and the list goes on and on. Everybody's excited about this space. Everybody wants to come in. Every leader in the organization is saying this is a hard one. Let's put it into this consortia collaboration. And I think it's incumbent on all of us as leaders in this space, because let's face it, if Amgen is going to jump into any of those collaborations, you're going to probably be sitting in all of those rooms, and you're going to be sitting in all those rooms from Novartis. And so it's important for all of us who work in companies that likely would end up in these different rooms, that we're making sure there are connections from one collaboration to the other, clear boundaries, picking up the work from one and leveraging it in the next. I think that there is work that consortia and collaborative efforts can do that raise all boats, kind of at a platform level. And I think you've called out some great ones around regulatory guidance, clarity around definitions and disambiguating in that space. I think that there is another domain of consortia efforts, which is let's start validating biomarkers together. And I think that gets very muddy, because we don't need like every collaboration going out trying to validate everything together. I think the core part to start with is to make sure we've got a common language and working with the regulators to create some clarity.
So a lot of different points come out there, and certainly one is don't let the specter of regulation or regulators override the reality of the situation, which I agree is that the regulators are saying, please bring us things we can regulate, right? Let us make a judgment on these things, bring us data. So that there's the aspect here of driving internal cooperation and internal acceptance, which I think you've hit on the point that when you're in an environment where most things fail, it's safer to fail the same than to fail different, right? So what do you, and I'll get to you. I mean, you have something right up this, Alex. I'll get to you in 1 second here if you want to jump in. But the one thing, I guess, we're looking at a sea of faces here of people who ultimately are going to have to be the ones who go back home to their job and convince their folks to jump on board. How do you convince people it's safe to fail different?
I like that phrase. I hadn't actually heard it, so I'm going to use it, Dan. But you're exactly right. That's exactly what's going on. They're just more comfortable in failing in the same space than in a different one. And I think it's about our effectiveness in communicating. Can we communicate to them in a better way? Because I think we're failing if we can't illustrate this opportunity and do it in a common way. And when we do it differently, it makes it more complex and more scary. So I think that aspect of it at least is on us.
Nobody wants to be the first, but nobody also wants to be the last. And so how can you find the early adopters in your organization with whom you can prove that, again, nobody died, nobody went to jail, that this can work and you can still have a job at the same time? And then how do you start to communicate that and socialize it so that fast followers in your organization can pick it up? There'll always be people on the fringe that you're going to have a hard time pulling into the umbrella. But the parallel that we've been, I think, successful with in our current organization at Pfizer, and I say current because we do like to change it up way too often, but this week's org chart, it's very supportive. And so now that we've got some of that grassroots effort is starting to read out with real data that shows an impact of reduced protocol deviations or the quality of the data and its integrity or whatever those measures may be, all of a sudden now we have our leadership's attention to give us the top-down push that we need, because culture just at a grassroots level is hard to change.
So we did have a question in the audience here. I'll bring you a microphone.
Donahue.
Thank you. This is great. I'm Cindy Gagan, and I'm a patient advocate. So other than and thank you, Craig, for mentioning City. I'll be presenting the results of the City potential patient survey looking at mobile clinical trust tomorrow. But the other group that everybody likes to blame besides regulators is patients. Patients won't do that. Patients are worried about privacy, et cetera. I know it's kind of early, but other than in iterative development of endpoints that matter and designing the trial, Have any of you had any experience with patient acceptance or recruitment to these kinds of trials? And in some of the apps, the retention goes way, way down. I didn't know if you experienced that, and it could be too soon.
Yeah,
Thank you for the question.
I can comment from my experience. So let me throw in another group too. So there's the patients, and then the other people that we tend to blame are the sites. This is more complicated for the site. They're never going to do it. I mean, for the Awake heart failure study that I mentioned earlier, part of what we need to do is gather a baseline of activity, right? We needed to baseline the activity, and ensure that baseline was, complete, before we would actually include a patient in the study. And everyone said, "Oh, this is never going to. I mean, the sites are never going to do it. They're never going to read the data. The patients." It actually turns out that everyone was completely engaged and was really receptive to all this. Another thing, we had to provision devices to the patients. They're never gonna do that. It turns out that what we're finding in the Awake heart failure study is that there was a cohort of patients that have actually preferred to bring their own device. They're so into it that they want to actually integrate it into their life more so than actually having a study device. So we've actually made that possible through modifying the protocol and everything like that. So I haven't per se, in my experience, though, that's limited. I think a lot of people have limited experience in putting digital technology in trials. I haven't really seen either of those two groups really be the barrier. It's actually and regulatory the same way. I mean, we've had some issues, but it's mainly internal, cultural. But yeah,
I can point to, so one example that comes to mind is when we were testing a certain wearable device in our phase 1 unit in Europe, and the informed consent mentioned a very large technology company on the West Coast whose name I will not mention with a camera on me. And it was about a fifth of the patients refused to sign the consent. Not because of Pfizer's name on it. They knew coming into a Pfizer CRU that we were involved, but because of that technology company's name on it. Now, that was an interesting insight to gain. That's an interesting insight that informed that I think we need to learn from. And I'd much rather learn that in a small experiment than learn it when trying to scale that up at large on a global basis. But it sort of just resonates that, we have to do those small experiments. You have to test these things in different populations, in different geographies, whether it's the experience of the site or the patient. One theme that I'm going to keep throwing out here today is, not everybody... Look at this room. How many people are taking notes on paper and pen, and how many are typing it? People have personal preferences, and we can't claim patient centricity by shoving everybody down a path, neither for the patient nor for the site. We need to find ways to give people to use these tools to provide flexibility and choice rather than just another narrow slice that we claim as patient-centric.
Yeah, I'll go out on a limb here and say one great way to find out what people want is to ask them.
Yeah.
I know it's wild. And sometimes you ask a bunch of them and you can get, you start to figure out what people want. One area where that's become really clear, and this is an interesting intersection of law and preference, is data sharing. Right. So I think we all agree up here and probably out there that developing novel data streams and finding meaning in them probably requires data sharing, right? You can't just do something in one place and not have it reproducible and ultimately have it be either meaningful or certainly accepted as meaningful. And we have this assumption patients want their data closely held. Whereas when you ask patients, is it okay if maybe we share this with maybe a couple of qualified researchers? Like, wait, you weren't going to share it? Like, why would you? I went to all the trouble to do this and you would just keep those data? So I think that asking goes an awfully long way toward figuring out what people want. Do you have a question there? I'll break the fourth wall again. Come from behind.
Hi there. Can you hear me? Yeah, Kevin Subin from AstraZeneca. I have a comment and a question, actually. So on the comment around sort of uptake and bring your own devices, we've run trials in a population that's supposedly quite elderly, and what we found in those situations is that many more people bring their own devices, even though they're over 65. I personally have been shamed into setting up a Facebook account by my parents because I didn't have one. So I think, first of all, even now, what we're seeing is that many more people have these devices and they're willing to use them. And as the population ages, we're getting the generation of people who are using smartphones and wearables, and they're getting it, they're moving into that age category. So I think that situation will improve. Then my question is more switching subject slightly around validation. So what we're trying to do here is we're trying to go from many paper-based PROs and using those in clinical trials into a much more sort of patient-centric area. Can you talk to the challenges of trying to validate more patient-centric, more patient-friendly type data collection and trying to draw conclusions from those?
I think that really does open up an interesting door. With 5 minutes left, one thing I think that we could do to elucidate that a little more, because that brings us sort of back into the NDE, the digital endpoint area. How do you think about validation largely? When you hear validation, that it means a lot of different things to a lot of people in this space. When you think about that as a large concept, how do you bucket that? How do you make sense of it?
Personally, I tend to revert back to the world before digital. I think there before the craze and enthusiasm around digital tools here, there were other endpoints that sucked, and we always looked for new ways to try and improve them. But in every one of those cases, the story was the same. You have to validate it against the gold standard, and you're looking around. Well, what's the gold standard? The one that I just said sucked that I want to get rid of, and now that's what I have to use as the gold standard for my next validation study. But I think that if you remove that word digital, there are pathways that are kind of worn and proven that folks, whether it's from a molecular perspective or other types of diagnostics, have been treading down for a long time. And personally, I think that here at Pfizer, our groups that work on the different types of biomarkers are getting closer and closer. And I think as an industry, we're all going to see that convergence.
Yeah, I echo that. Most of the time when I think about validation, it's really a comparative sort of study between what is accepted and what we're trying to do. And that validation can have different complexity to it based on what you're talking about. So from the EPRO space, just to kind of answer a little bit of your question, we're doing some really cool things around pediatric diaries. So I think before there was I forget the age, but there below a certain age, I think it was 6, if I'm not mistaken, the parents actually had to complete the diary for them by regulation, and for subjective measurements like pain, how does one do that in a meaningful way? And so we're working to actually create a diary, which is now we're trying to validate so that children of all ages can actually fill it out, or to the extent that they can do it. And so that's actually requiring quite a bit of work to work with agencies to do. Hopefully there is a faster and better way ultimately to doing all this, but yeah.
Because we're getting to our last 2 minutes here, I'm going to give you guys an optimistic finish here, because I started at the pessimistic side. If, by the way, you're thinking, if the word validation comes up in your work, you ought to know probably like 5 words that you can put before validate that qualify it a little better. Because if you do that, if you have different types of validation in your head, then you probably won't use the word validate alone as much. And you'll have better conversations about validation because they'll be a little better specified. I'm sure someone will talk about that later today. But for the end point here, guys, the horizon. What can you see on the horizon that you're most excited about? And you have to do this in like one sentence. And what's the step you take tomorrow that moves you in that direction? It's a surprise question.
Well, in my mind, right, there's two things going on, and one, and this conference is really about one of them. So this the rise of the Internet of Things, and then AI getting continually smarter. And I think those two things coming together and maturing are going to offer an unprecedented opportunity for the industry to really change how medicine is practiced, how we do trials. I mean, I see the development paradigm completely shifting in my mind in a number of different ways. Decentralization is a huge one there. I think, Craig, your team has inspired everyone, years back when you were in remote, but now we're seeing that actually becoming, a real scalable reality. And I think that's going to be amazing. The other thing that I'm seeing as a potential is humanless trials. So getting so good at being able to imitate human experience or human response in a trial that we actually won't even need to include them in some instances. I'm not saying replace phase 3 validation studies right off the bat, but I think this is becoming a real possibility now.
So I'll build on that. There's this great opportunity with technology, whether AI or IoT, and the convergence of that with the regulators' press around patient-focused drug development. And so now you have this combined effort of go engage patients and learn what endpoints matter to them, and amazing technologies that are available to us to deliver against that. So it's this convergence of not just one, but both that's going to make this incredibly potent. I spend a lot of time internally at Pfizer talking to groups about obsolescence and who's going to be obsolete in our ecosystem. Jacob stole one of them, which is the patient. And in the clinical trial paradigm, potentially as we get better and smarter with data. I think CRO obsolescence is a great topic for the coffee break or the bar at the end of the day. But the last one I would throw out, though, is for those that are research sponsors and development organizations, your obsolescence, my obsolescence. Last week, I watched a video on Facebook Live of a patient in the UK self-administering an investigational medicine that he biohacked for HIV. The proliferation of biologic printers, of information resources online, of biohacking spaces that are popping up right next door to where once upon a time it was all about, digital hacking spaces. We will be displaced by patients if we don't find ways to work with them and keep pace with them. The story of patients like me that they exposed years ago in the ALS community of patients purchasing and formulating sodium chloride and self-administering, and then not only creating their own medicine and self-administering, but opening up a Google sheet and sharing their own tracked results with others in the community, effectively running their own study that they made the drug and were sharing data in real time. We will be displaced if we don't find ways to use these tools in collaborative ways with patients.
Those are good examples. I'll add to it as well. I think the emergence of consumer genetics is another space that's going to be enlightening and empowering to patients. And I agree with you guys. I think the future is around pragmatic trials or integrated research with standard of care, and where it's effectively a standard is. And so I think that's really exciting. I'll try to speak to that here in a minute. I know we're short of time.
Yeah, and I think that does it for us today. So will you guys all please join me in thanking Craig and Matt and Jacob